Hey guys, it's Laurie. Thank you so much for stopping by and hanging out with me. My house is basically in a pine forest, and we had a crazy windstorm blow through a few weeks ago. I actually posted it on my Instagram story, and it literally left millions and millions of pine cones everywhere. So, being someone that likes to craft, I walked around and picked a whole ton up, and that was my inspiration to make this project. I'm starting my pine cone wreath with the 14-inch wire frame from the Dollar Tree. I need some type of a base to attach my pine cones to, so I'm going to use the Dollar Tree burlap ribbon, but you can use anything that you have on hand. I wrapped the ribbon end around the form and I glued it in place. I began wrapping it around, making sure every once in a while to add a little hot glue to hold it in place. I did end up needing 2 rolls of the burlap ribbon. To add my second ribbon, I just attached it with some hot glue to the end of my first, and then I continued on wrapping it around the wreath frame. While I was wrapping the burlap, I wasn't super fussy because no one's going to see the front. When you're done, your form will be completely covered, and like I said, you can use anything that you have on hand as long as the cones and the hot glue will attach to it. With the wreath form wrapped, we're now ready to get busy. I'm painting about 75 pine cones, and I'm choosing red, green, white, and a clear coat. Nothing glamorous here, I just laid the pine cones down on an old piece of cardboard. And now I'm adding a coat of spray paint to each side. You can use normal spray paint, and I did for my white and my clear coat, but for the red and green, I ended up using this florist spray paint. They usually use it on flowers. The color is usually less dramatic, and my sister-in-law gave me a whole ton of this paint in all different colors when she was closing up her floral business. So I figured instead of running out and spending money, I would just use what I had on hand. When my red and green pine cones were done, I then used regular white spray paint, and I sprayed my next batch. I also sprayed some with clear coat. I waited for all my pine cones to dry on one side. I flipped them over and then gave them a coat on the back. I used Christmas colors for my project, but I think any colors at all would look absolutely beautiful. I'm adding on a simple wire hanger. It'll just make it that much easier when you want to hang your wreath. And all I did was take 2 pieces of some heavy gauge floral wire, and I just kind of twisted it together, and then I wrapped it around my wreath form, and then I twisted it into a little loop. The finished wreath isn't that heavy, so if you don't have wire, you can use something else that you have on hand. Once my pine cones had dried, I brought them inside and I separated them into colors. To start the project, I just picked the random color of green, and using my hot glue gun, I glued my first pine cone onto the side. I'm gluing them all in the same direction and at an angle. I'm also keeping them pretty much in the same color pattern, but this is completely optional. Now that the outer layer is complete, I'm going to work on the middle, and I'm following the exact same instructions. Before spraying them, I did bake my pine cones in the oven on a foil-lined cookie sheet at 200 degrees for about 30 minutes. Once they're cool and when the sap feels dry, even though they were sprayed, they still have that nice pine aroma. This wreath works up super quick, and I think it would make a really nice gift for someone. I'm now finishing up the center ring of the pine cones. I'm doing the exact same thing, just hot gluing them into place. This time around though, you may have to add some additional hot glue to the sides of the pine cone. It just kind of helps it stick in place. When I was done with my center ring, and this is completely optional, I had some thinner pine cones. I placed some hot glue on the side, and then I just pushed them against the bottom row and kind of tucked them up underneath it. And like I said, this is completely optional. It just gave it a nicer finished look, but if you don't have these, just leaving it with 3 rows looks great too. At this point, your wreath is complete, but if you want to continue on, which I'm doing, I'm going to fill it out with some of my leftover pine cones. They're too big, so I'm cutting off about 1 inch from the end. To finish up my super easy project, I randomly glued the shorter pine cones here and there throughout the wreath. I so love the way this wreath came out. I think it's beautiful, and I can't wait to hang it up for Christmas. I love the fact that I used pine cones from my own yard, and by using some Dollar Tree supplies, I think it cost me about $8 to make. And once my last pine cone is glued into place, it's ready to hang. To begin this project, you'll need the red wooden truck and the 14-inch wire wreath form, both from the Dollar Tree. I'm also using 5 different types of ribbons that I purchased at Michael's. I'm using a burlap type wired ribbon, and you will need the whole roll. It's 75 feet. I'm also using the black and white and the red and black buffalo plaid check. I'm also using a 7/8 inch black and white check and a 2.5 inch gold wired ribbon. You're also going to need some floral wire. I have 2 different styles here, either will work. I'm also using some items that I have in my stash. I'm using 5 of these gold glitter Dollar Tree stars, along with this little white star that I had left over from my 4th of July supplies. I'm using some small pine cones and some of these small red berry picks. I'm using these colors from my wreath, but you can customize your colors to match your home decor. To cover our wreath, you're going to start with the burlap type ribbon. You're going to fold it in half and then fold it in half again. Take a piece of wire and push it through the 4 layers of the ribbon. Once that's complete, you're going to attach it to the support bar on the wreath form. Once it's twisted on, you can either cut off the extra wire or just kind of wrap it around the support. To make the wreath, we're going to form 3 separate loops on 3 of the separate sections. You're going to pull some of the ribbon through the bottom and pretty much then decide what size loop you want. After slipping the first loop of ribbon through the wire form, you're then going to slip another piece of the ribbon through the wire form. While you're doing this, make sure that you're holding on to your ribbon. Then slip the last piece of ribbon through the last wired section. It's a little tricky at first, but just make sure that you hold on to your loops. Now turn your wreath over, making sure that you hold on to your loops. You're then going to twist your ribbon 2 or 3 times. you're going to go back down to the bottom and follow the exact same instructions. You're going to pull your ribbon through the bottom section, and then the middle section, and then the top section, making sure that you keep them all the same size as you go along. Once again, turn your wreath over, and now you start to see how the loops are forming your wreath. Once again, making sure that you keep the ribbon twist tightly in your hand, start to make another row of the loops. After each row of the ribbon loops, you can decide how tightly you want the wreath by how closely you push them together. It's a bit tedious, but just keep making your loops and be sure when you twist on the back of the ribbon that you keep it tight before starting your next row of loops. I put 4 rows of loops in each section of this wreath. I continued looping the ribbon through the 3 separate sections and pushing them tightly together. You can always change up the red truck that you're putting on the wreath. If you don't want it to be a holiday wreath, you can remove the word Merry Christmas and repaint the truck red, and also remove the Christmas tree off the back. And by doing this, you can make it more of a seasonal wreath and not so much a holiday wreath. To complete the ribbon part of this wreath, I used almost the whole roll, which was 75 feet. To attach the last piece of ribbon to the wreath, I just cut it from the roll. Then, using a piece of wire like I did in the beginning, I folded the ribbon in half and then in half again, and then I slipped the wire through the ribbon and attached it to one of the center supports. I then just straightened all the loops of the ribbon and kind of evened them out. To help keep everything in place, I ran a bead of glue along the 2 wire supports on the back of the wreath. I'm using 4 different types of ribbon for this project. I'm going to make 12 bows with 3 pieces of ribbon in each one. Each ribbon is going to be 10 inches in length, and all I did was cut a piece of cardstock at 10 inches, and then I wrapped the ribbon around it 6 times. Then, using my scissors, I just cut the ribbon from the cardstock. This is an easy way to get your ribbons cut quickly. Then, using my scissors, I cut both ends of the ribbon away from the cardstock. Once all your pieces are cut, we're now going to dovetail the ends. You can dovetail your ribbons one at a time, or you can put a couple together, and that's what I'm doing here. You fold the ribbons in half and then just cut away at an angle. You're going to do this to all 48 ribbons. Once your ribbons are cut and dovetailed, we're now going to group them into sections. I'm using some floral wire that I have on hand, and I'm actually going to cut it in half because you don't need this full-size piece. I'm using 3 pieces of the ribbon together, folding it in half to find my center point, and then I'm just going to squeeze it together and use the half piece of the floral wire, fold it over the top of the ribbon, turn it over, and twist it tightly together. Once that pattern of ribbon was complete, I moved on to my next pattern. I chose to use a thinner ribbon in this group of bows, and it was just personal preference. You can use the same size for each, or you can change up the size of the ribbons. When you're finished, you'll have 12 bows. I placed the red truck in the center of the wreath, and this will give me an idea of where I want to place my bows. Once I decided where I wanted to place the bows, I just removed the red truck from the wreath. I secured the wires around 2 of the metal supports inside of the wreath. When I placed the ribbons near the back, I used the 2 bottom, and when I placed the ribbons near the front, I used the 2 top supports. And just make sure that when you twist the wire on, you twist it tightly to the support. After that, all you do is continue around your wreath and just attach the 12 clusters of bows. Once I was done, I just fanned them out around the wreath, filling up all the little spaces. I'm going to soften up the red color of the truck and give it some definition with my pencil. I used the edge of the pencil to run it along the edges of the truck, and then I just smoothed it out using my finger. This step is completely optional, but I like the way the pencil brings out the 3D features of the truck. Once your truck's complete, we're now going to add on this little star. This too is completely optional, but I had this in my stash from the 4th of July, so I just hot glued it onto the top of my tree. I then hot glued my truck into place in the center of the wreath. Now it's time to add the 5 gold stars. I decided where I wanted them to be, and then using my hot glue gun, I secured them into place. Once all the stars are in place, I'm then going to add in the pine cones. I'm using 6 small pine cones, and once I decided where I wanted them to be, I then used my hot glue gun and attached them in place. For my final step, I'm adding a little accent to the wreath. I'm using some of these red berry picks, and I'm cutting them into smaller stems, and then I'm just randomly adding them around my wreath. And when I'm done, it's ready to hang. To make my Christmas ornament wreath, I'm using an assortment of small, medium, and large bulbs that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. And I'm using a 13.5-inch foam ring that I picked up at Michael's, but you can use the Dollar Tree foam ring instead. Getting started, I'm using some Dollar Tree ribbon to make a hanger for my wreath. All you need to do is wrap the ribbon around the form and hot glue it into place. Then make a loop with the same ribbon and hot glue that to the form. Before you cut your ribbon away from the spool, cut an extra 2 to 3 inches and then just glue that around the rest of the form. I'm starting my wreath with the large and the medium ornaments. I'm adding some hot glue to the side of a large ornament and placing it against the side of the form. And then I'm following that with adding some hot glue to the side of a medium ornament, and I'm placing that next to the large one. From there, I alternate the large and the medium ornaments, and I continue hot gluing them around the outside of the wreath until I make a complete circle. When I was done, I placed small and medium ornaments in the center for placement, and when I was happy with them, I then once again used my glue gun and I hot glued them into place. This honestly has to be one of the easiest wreaths I've ever made. I'm then now using my glue gun and I'm adding on some of the large and the medium sized bulbs, and I'm just hot gluing them onto the center of the form. So that you don't see the ends of the ornaments, I'm just using my glue gun and I'm kind of facing the ends towards each other so that they're basically hidden. Now that I have my form completely covered, I'm adding on my smaller bulbs and I'm filling in any of the open spaces. I just continued adding them on until my wreath was round and full of bulbs and ready to hang for the holidays. I'm starting my Let It Snow wreath by using the 14-inch wire form from the Dollar Tree. Along with the white mesh, my Dollar Tree was carrying this really pretty white flocked mesh. So I'm going to be using both of these in the project, and I will list all the supplies down below in my description. Getting started, I'm pairing up the white and the flocked mesh. When I'm working with more than one roll of mesh, I like to pair them up. It's just so much easier to work with one roll. To attach the mesh, I'm using chenille stems that I cut in half. I'm starting by pairing up my flocked and white mesh, and I'm gathering the two ends together and attaching them with a chenille stem. Once I'm done, I go under the form and attach it to the center supports. Here comes the fun part, making sure that you keep the mesh together. You're then going to slide them under the first two rows on the form. I'm making my loops about 3 inches. After my first loop, I'm making my second by pushing the mesh through the second and third sections on the form. Be sure to hold on to your loops while you're doing this. To finish off my row, I'm now placing the mesh through the last two sections. And to help keep everything in place, I'm then going to twist it a couple of times. And now all I'm doing is taking my mesh, moving it back to the front, and making another loop next to my first loop. Be sure to hold each loop tightly to keep things in place, and also be sure that your mesh is running together. I'm making my wreath with double rolls of mesh because I like a thicker wreath, but you can always do this with single rolls of mesh as well. I continue adding the loops, and you'll notice as they fill the section, you'll no longer need to hold on to them. When I come to the end of the section, I'm gathering the two ends of mesh and attaching them together with a chenille stem and placing them around the wire support just like I did in the beginning. I was only able to find 3 rolls of the flocked mesh, so on my wreath I'm going to alternate the sections by using the flocked and then the plain white. Starting my second section, I'm following the exact same instructions. I'm pairing up my 2 pieces of plain white mesh and attaching them together with the chenille stem. Once again, I'm attaching that to the center support, placing my mesh under the form, and then starting my first loop in the first section. I double checked my loops, making sure they were the same size. You're going to add your second and then your third loop. Then once again, twist your mesh and follow the same instructions. One thing I learned while making this wreath is that Dollar Tree mesh loves sweaters. As you can see, I'm wearing one, and I think at one point there was more mesh attached to me than the wreath. So I guess one quick tip is don't wear a sweater while you're making this wreath. I continued working my way around until it was completely full. I'm starting off with some ribbon accents, and I bought these at Hobby Lobby for 50% off, but the Dollar Tree has some really pretty holiday ribbon. To make my ribbons easier to cut, I cut a 10-inch piece of cardboard, and I wrapped this really pretty tool that I found at the Dollar Tree around it 4 times. I'm using this tool under my ribbons, so once I had it wrapped and cut, I then folded it in half and cut it into 8 pieces. I'm adding 3 different ribbons along with the tool, so I'm cutting 8 10-inch ribbons out of each pattern. With them all cut, I'm now going to dovetail the ends. Dovetailing the ends is super easy. All I did was fold the ribbon and the tool in half and then cut away the end at an angle. To make my ribbon accents, I'm attaching them together with some floral wire. I'm making 8 ribbon clusters, and I'm keeping my tool on the bottom of each. I'm making 4 accents with the white snowflakes on the top. I make sure that the ends match up. Fold the bundle in half, place the floral wire over the center, and then twist it together tightly. I'm then making 4 bundles with the blue snowflakes on the top. I'm adding my 8 ribbon accents, and I'm spacing them evenly around the wreath. To hold the ribbons in place, I'm finding the 2 center supports and wrapping the wire around those. I moved around the wreath, adding my ribbons until all 8 were attached. For the center of my wreath, I'm using the Let It Snow sign from the Dollar Tree. To complement my ribbons, I'm painting it with this pretty blue acrylic paint. Once my Let It Snow was done, I then painted the snowflake white. Because my wreath is a gift and I'm not sure if it will be exposed to any of the elements, I ended up giving the Let It Snow a coat of Mod Podge. When everything was dry, I had this sparkly snowflake in my stash, so I hot glued it over the snowflake on the sign. I want my sign to be permanent, so I centered it and then hot glued it to the mesh. What's a Let It Snow wreath without some snowflakes? I'm adding in a package of the Dollar Tree snowflakes, and I'm hot gluing them evenly around the wreath. After the plain white snowflakes were added, I'm now going to add my inspiration snowflakes. When I found these at the Dollar Tree, these are what inspired me to make this wreath. I was only able to find 6, so I'm going to evenly space these on the wreath as well. Once all these beautiful snowflakes are attached, I'm going to give it a little jingle with these large jingle bells from the Dollar Tree. Adding them is super easy. I'm going to hot glue one in the center of each of my bows. To add a frosty accent to my wreath, I'm using some of these silver branches from the Dollar Tree. I cut them into pieces and I hot glued them here and there to accent the wreath. I took a look at it and I just didn't think the snowflake on the front was enough. Just seemed like it was lacking. So I went into my stash and I found this pretty Dollar Tree snowflake ornament. I thought that might be perfect on the front. That was exactly what this wreath needed, and now it's complete. I'm starting my wreath by using one of the 14-inch wire wreath forms from the Dollar Tree. I don't want the form to show through the beard, so I'm going to be wrapping it with some white ribbon. A friend of mine owned a flower shop and she willed me all her floral supplies, so I've had this ribbon for 40 years and it's not perfect, but it'll definitely work for this project. To attach the ribbon and wrap the form, I'm just placing some hot glue on one of the supports and then adding the ribbon. I then start wrapping it tightly around the form, and I'm adding a little hot glue here and there to help hold it into place. If you don't have any white ribbon on hand, you can always wrap it with a different color. I've used some of the burlap ribbon from the Dollar Tree before, and then I just painted it white, and that will work just as well. When I needed to add some more ribbon, I just used some hot glue, attached the ribbon, and then just continued working my way around the form. My wreath form completely covered in ribbon, I now need to find something to fill up the center. I'm using one of my leftover Dollar Tree ornament signs, but you can use anything that you have on hand. All you need to do is fill up the center of the form. I'm going to be using the back side of the sign, so I'm just turning it over and using my white acrylic paint, I'm giving it a complete coat. Once it's dry, I'm then using my glue gun and attaching it to the center of the form. Once my sign has set up in the center, I'm then going to gently fold over the sides of the form. And it will take a little bit of muscle, but you'll be able to do it. Just kind of gently fold them over. For Santa's nose, I'm using a styrofoam ball, and this was actually part of a 2-pack that I found at the Dollar Tree. I'm using my knife and cutting off a slice so that I have one flat side. To paint the nose, you can use any color you'd like. I'm going to use this pretty coral acrylic paint. And then I'm just going to give it a complete coat. Once the nose is completely dry, I'm using my glue gun and attaching it about 1/3 of the way down from the top in the center. To make Santa's beard, I'm using some white fabric from a recycled fabric shower curtain. I originally used it in my patriotic rag wreath tutorial, and I'm using the rest of it for this project. I'm cutting 18-inch strips, so I'm working with a 36 by 30 piece of fabric folded in half. Once I have my fabric in place, I'm then cutting my strips anywhere from about 1/2 inch to 1 inch, making sure to leave about an inch of uncut fabric at the top. As you can see, while I'm cutting, I'm not making them perfect, and they're kind of assorted different sizes. That's because I want my Santa's beard to have more of a rustic look. If you prefer more of a uniform look, then just choose a size, and that will look great too. When you're done, your fabric will look like a long piece of fringe. I'm adding a piece of ribbon on as a tie, and so the easiest way I found to do this was to open up the fabric so that it revealed my flat uncut center. If you have a lot of patience, you can just weave it through, but it was so much white that it just seemed much easier to do it this way. When I was done, I used a really thin ribbon. It's like that 50-cent a roll ribbon. I gave myself about a 5-inch tail, and then I just laid it flat across the center of my fabric. When I was done, I added a dot of hot glue in the center just to kind of anchor the ribbon. I then flipped one side over the other and shook all the pieces into place. From there, I just kind of shimmied the sides of the fabric down towards the center. With all my fabric gathered, I'm then going to pull it up under Santa's nose and tie it on the top into a knot. When I'm done, I'm just using my fingers and combing through his beard and separating all the different pieces of fabric. Now that I have the pieces basically where I want them, I'm going to use my hot glue gun, and I'm going to add a little hot glue on the side to hold those pieces of fabric in place. After my one side was done, I then used my glue gun and attached the other. Does anyone else think this looks like a Muppet? I don't know, I think he looks like a Muppet. I then used my glue gun and I placed some hot glue onto the covered wreath form. And then I just kind of guided some random pieces of fabric into place. I then continued working my way around until I had the form basically covered. I'm placing a hat on Santa, so by gluing this all into place, it just kind of sets my guidelines of where I'm going to add my hat. To make Santa's mustache, I'm using another piece of fabric. It roughly measures 10 by 16. I folded it in half, and now I'm just cutting my roughly 1/2 inch to 1 inch pieces. With all my strips cut, I'm turning them into loops by placing a little hot glue on one end and then just overlapping the other. Once all my loops are made, I'm then taking each loop, I'm folding it in half and hot gluing one side to the other. I ended up making 15 of the double loops, and adding them onto Santa is super easy. I added a bit of hot glue at the very beginning of the beard, and then I took the folded end of my loop and I tucked it under Santa's nose. From there, I continued adding the hot glue and adding on my loops, slightly overlapping one over the other. I really didn't end up needing 15 of my double loops, but because I made them and I didn't have anything else to do with them, I just ended up gluing them on. Now that I have Santa's beard and mustache all in place, it's time to add on his hat. I'm using this pretty snowflake hat that I found at the Dollar Tree. My gnome's head is too big for the hat, and the hat is actually 2 pieces sewn together. So I'm using my seam ripper and I'm pulling apart the side just about 3/4 of the way up. Now that the hat's large enough to fit, I'm going to place it over my Santa's head. And now that I have it in place, I'm running a bead of glue across the nose and attaching the hat. From there, I'm pulling one of the sides down slightly. I'm adding some hot glue and I'm tucking it around the wreath form. I'm then following the exact same instructions for the other side. I don't want his hat to sit flat against his head, so I'm using some of this recycled polyfill that I had, and I'm just going to lightly stuff the hat. With my hat complete, I'm then turning it over and I'm making sure to place the nose on something soft so it doesn't get dented. I'm adding some hot glue to the back of the form. I'm folding over the hat fabric and I'm attaching it in place. I then continued adding the hot glue and folding over the fabric until the back of the hat was completely attached. When I was done, I turned it over, I added a little hot glue to the pom-pom, and I attached that in place as well. I'm adding a simple accent to his hat, and I found this pretty snowflake ornament at the Dollar Tree. There's a little loop where the hanger goes, so I just used my snippers and snipped it off. Attaching it to the hat was super easy. I just placed some hot glue on the back and then placed it on the hat. I'm adding a little bit of greenery and I'm just using a couple of leaves that I had left over from a past project. I placed each behind the snowflake and then hot glued them into place. When I was done and to finish up, all that's left is to give Santa's beard a trim. I used my fingers and I combed through Santa's beard, making sure all the strips of fabric were even. I used my scissors and kept cutting up the sides until I shaped it into a point. And when I was done, my Santa gnome wreath was ready to hang. I'm starting my merry and bright wreath by using one of the Dollar Tree 14-inch wire forms. And of course, the inspiration for my wreath, the merry and bright wooden cutout. I'll also be using about a roll and a half of the red, white, and green mesh. You'll need some chenille stems or pipe cleaners. I'm using these from the Dollar Tree. I just happen to have them in my stash, but any color will work. I'll be cutting my pieces of mesh at 10 inches, and to make it easier, I've cut out this 10-inch piece of cardstock. I start by wrapping my mesh around the card, and once it's complete, I then cut it at both ends. I'm doing this for all three colors, and it makes cutting the mesh so much easier and quicker. I'm using the classic Christmas colors for my wreath, but I think there are an array of holiday colors that would also work nicely. With my mesh now cut and ready, I'm going to cut some of my chenille stems in half. For this wreath, I want a large open curl. I'm using a single piece of mesh and I'm not rolling it too tightly. When I'm done, I place one of the half chenille stems over the center and twist it together. I'm adding 14 curls per section, so I'm making 28 in each color for a total of 84. When you're done, you'll have a pretty bouquet of mesh curls. Adding my mesh to the wreath, I'm going to be working on the two outer sections and the two inner sections. I'm starting with my red and I'm wrapping my chenille stems around the two outer rails on the form. Once that's attached, I'm now going to add my white, but this time on the two inside rails of the form. With my red and white attached, I'm now adding my green, and this time I'm attaching it back to the two outer sections. I like to turn my form upside down when I'm attaching the mesh, just to be sure that I have the curls centered in between the sections. I'm continuing on adding my colors and alternating back and forth from the outside section to the inside section until my wreath is completely covered. This looks so pretty just with the curls, but I'm going to be making it merry and bright by adding on some pretty ribbon. I'm using what I already have on hand, and I did buy these at Michael's last year after Christmas. They are two different patterns and they are both 2.5 inches wide. I'm also using some white ribbon that I purchased at Michael's at the same time, and this is 1.5 inches. To make the bow for my wreath, I'm measuring a 6-inch tail. I'm pinching it together and then measuring out an 8-inch loop. I'm going to pinch it, add it to my tail, and then make an additional 8-inch loop. Once I pinch it, I'm going to slightly twist it and add it to my other loop. To finish, I measure and cut another 6-inch tail. I'm going to use a clip to hold my bow together while I cut my next ribbon. To make my white bow, I'm following the exact same instructions. I'm going to make a 6-inch tail, 2 8-inch loops, and then a final 6-inch tail. Now that I'm done, I'm removing the clip and adding the two bows together. I'm using a piece of floral wire. I'm placing it over the top of the two ribbons and then twisting it together tightly. I fluffed open my bow and now I'm dovetailing the ends. Dovetailing is super easy. You just fold the ribbon in half and cut away at an angle. I'm making 8 bows in all, and after I make my first 4, I'm then making my second 4 following the exact same instructions. Now that all 8 are complete, I'm going to be adding them to the wreath. I fluffed my bows open and then found the 2 center sections on the form. Using the 2 wires on my bow, I placed them over the supports. I flipped my wreath over and then I twisted them on tightly. After I attached my first bow, I then, using the same patterned bow, attached my next one directly across from the first. Keeping with the same pattern of bow, I then attached my next 2 by doing the exact same thing and attaching them directly across from each other. For my second patterned bow, I followed the exact same instructions, attaching each one across from the other. For me, this is the easiest way to attach the bows and to make sure that they are evenly spaced around the wreath. Once all my bows were added and in place, I went around the wreath and I fluffed them up. I'm painting my merry and bright sign with my red, white, and green acrylic paint. Like I said before, I chose to use Christmas colors for this project, but I think there are so many seasonal colors that would look just as pretty. Now that it has dried, I'm hot gluing 4 pieces of floral wire onto the back. I'm placing my hot glue on the 4 corners. I'm folding my floral wire in half and then popping it into place. Once the glue has set up, I'm centering the sign on the middle of the wreath and I'm attaching the wires underneath. I'm using floral wire, but chenille stems will work just as well. With my sign attached, I'm now going to add on some mini ornaments. I bought these last year and I can't remember if I bought them at the Dollar Tree, but I do know that the Dollar Tree sells them in single color packs. Using my hot glue gun, I'm placing a dab of glue in the center of each of the bows, and then I'm alternating the green-red color with my ornaments. With all my smaller ornaments in place, I'm now going to add the next size up. I'm adding these red and green ornaments to the outside of the wreath. Once again, I'm using my hot glue gun and I'm going to glue them directly onto the mesh. I'm alternating the colors of red and green and I'm attaching them in between each of the bows on the outer edge of the wreath. With these pretty ribbons and our sparkly ornaments, our merry and bright wreath is complete and ready to hang. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I hope you enjoyed making these 6 different holiday wreaths. If you're new to my channel and you're thinking, hey, I'd like to come back and hang out with her again, don't forget to click that little red subscribe button below and tap on the notification bell so you'll be notified every time I upload a new video. Have an awesome day and I'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.